When I tell you that this is the third time I'm trying to make this video, I'm not joking, and I'm on the verge of cranky. So I'm gonna try. Uh, I'm gonna try again because I want to talk about this. So, Into the Wild Woods was a sort of Instagram challenge, conversation, Facebook group, something or other, collection of things that Kelly from the Truth and Story started this month in celebration part of the publication of the new book um, for that goes with the Wildwood Tarot of Wild Magic. I'm gonna come back to that in a second. So my first attempt at this video was a long, discursive, hour-long exploration of the last 30 days. And I lost it. Thank you, Apple. I went to click the stop recording button, and then the video disappeared. And then I tried it again, and it disappeared again. I have done 2 tests since that have worked, and so I'm going to hope this does. And if it doesn't, I don't know. I'll try again tomorrow. Sometimes I wonder when I make videos and they don't work if the universe is telling me to shut the fuck up. But I feel like I'm going to talk about this stuff. So, I am going to talk about this stuff. I am going to break this video into small recorded sessions, but string it together, so you won't really notice the difference. But I want to let you know why you're seeing, transitions. So the first thing I want to talk about is why Into the Wild Woods sort of is garnering my attention right now, and why it's been sort of a thing. This has been, gosh, I'm not trolls always tell me I'm fat, but not fat enough to hide the clutter behind me. So maybe I should do the whole video this way. It's the perils of a small apartment, that you're sharing with somebody. Why was Into the Wild Woods so important for me this month? I wasn't anticipating on participating. It was the thing that I thought, oh, that's cool. I don't have the Wildwood Tarot. I don't sort of have a relationship with Celtic shamanism. But I think that's awesome. And excuse me. At a certain moment, I'm getting a cold. At a certain moment, I thought, I kind of want to play. I don't know. And sometimes things like that happen for a reason. So I accepted the call, and I went off and I bought the Wildwood Tarot and a couple other Will Worthington decks. Not the Druidcraft. I'll talk about that. Well, I'll talk about the other decks, not the Druidcraft, because I don't have it. It just that was one that didn't call to me. But the Druid Plant and Animal Oracles and the Wildwood Tarot, I worked with quite a lot. But later in the video, I'll talk about the decks I worked with and why. First, I just want to talk about kind of the impact of doing this, because it was powerful. The last, I don't know, 90 days or so, the last few months, the last quarter of the year, has not been my favorite. There were sort of 3 parts of life that were bugging me. One of them was just my relationship with my creative work. I've talked before on my channel about being a playwright, and that's a big part of my life. And, I'm earning my master's degree in it. I have one more summer. And for folks who have any sort of tangential relationship with theater, that sounds cool, but it's a thing that, it's not a career. I'm getting my master's degree in it because it's something I always wanted to get an MFA. Like, master's programs, especially MFAs, are fun because you get to spend time with other people who love doing what you do, whether they're other students or your instructors. But it's expensive. And then, the process of getting a play produced is like you write the play and you work on the play and you do readings and you rewrite it and finally you say, okay, this is ready, and you submit it to theaters. And there's not a lot of theaters in the country that, in particular, that do new plays, and so you're trying to get people to get interested in your work, and it's rejection, like any creative work that you put out there, and you have to do submissions. And then if you happen to eventually get a theater interested, then it's usually a small theater who's sort of on a shoestring budget, and you love that. But if you go out there to see the piece, it's usually at your own expense. So there's another cost. And I just came to a point where, like, after years of that being okay and enough, I don't know. Suddenly this year it was like not enough, and it wasn't okay, and it was like, why am I spending all this money to do this thing that no one asked me to do and no one really cares about? And I just felt like I'm sick of begging. I'm sick of asking for permission. I'm sick of asking for help. I'm sick of trying to get people interested in something that, that I felt like doesn't really matter, and in a sense really doesn't, especially when you look at the shape of the world right now. So I was in sort of a funky mood about that, and then, um, you know, I, this is a more personal video than I usually do, but so I talked about this a little bit. My grandfather passed away earlier this year, just a couple months ago or a month or so ago. I can't remember the date. Time and I have a strange relationship. Um, and it was one of those things where, it was a long time coming. He had advanced dementia. It was really hard on my dad. But I have a strange relationship with family, in part because growing up sort of a little gay boy, it wasn't easy, and your relatives love you as you look back on it, but you also know they did and said things that really left wounds. And even after years of therapy, it's like you accept that it's their upbringing and their experience that led them to that, but it still doesn't erase the scar. You know what I mean? So having a complicated relationship with my family, it's that sounds so stupid and it sounds so white and Western and whatever, but it was there. That was impactful, and so one thing that had sort of cropped up into my mind was this idea of like, oh, I've done a really good job over the years, sort of like remembering the stuff that hurt and forgetting the stuff that was good, and then suddenly you eulogize people in your head and you think, oh right, there was good stuff there. Like that's the person who taught me how to like love food. You know what I mean? Baked goods, whatever. So you that's the person who taught me how to play X, Y, or Z. So you have a complicated relationship looking back, and you think, I don't have it like a, I'm not the perfect person I like to think I am. So there was that. There was this thing about loss, and I have like a Jekyll and Hyde relationship with loss. So I have like on the one hand this very mature relationship with it, where it's like I recognize impermanence, as the PBS documentary. If you watch the PBS documentary about Buddhism a few years ago, this one of the panelists talks about this really nice way of exploring the idea of an impermanence, and it's like this idea of I have this glass and I love it and I cherish it and I'm so passionate about it and I'm so happy I have it, and then someone knocks it off the table and it shatters and I'm devastated. But if I accept that the glass is broken when I get it, then every moment I have with it is special. Like that unlocked something. That idea of impermanence unlocked something in me over the years, and so I have a sense, and like a mature sense, that like loss is, and that's just part of who we are. In a way, we need it. I think about Thich Nhat Hanh talking about a toothache. And he talks about how when we don't have a toothache, we don't think about it, but then we have a toothache, and all we can think of is how desperate we are to get rid of it. And it's like we need the toothache to remind ourselves of what it's like to not have a toothache. So loss in that way is we need the grim times. But so there's that, but then there's also this other part of me that's really good at like pretending I don't have feelings and I don't care and whatever. And then there's like a third branch of what's been going on in my mind, sort of related to the second one, which is just this idea of ancestry and family and history. And in my case, I'm French Canadian on both sides, which means on both sides I have some Native American, and my mother's father was half Native American, and he was so, he was trained by life to be so embarrassed about that. And I'm just, there's stories there that you never get to hear, and you sort of wonder about his mother, who is Native American, and there's a complicated story there too. But so that's been part of the equation too. So there's this idea of ancestry, this idea of family, this idea of connection, this idea of creative, sort of the things you view as your life's work, your purpose, the things you're passionate about. All of those things were really barking at me in complicated ways in the last few months. And all of that kind of came out and alive and aloud during the work that I did and the readings I did during the prompts for Into the Wild Woods. So it was this weird sort of synchronicity and a way of taking all these kind of disparate things that were contributing to kind of an overall sense of lowness, really. I mean, I'm not a person who's struggled with depression a lot. It's been there, mostly in college, mostly in my 20s. The real sort of albatross that I've had to deal with in my life was anxiety, sort of crippling anxiety. But depression was sort of there and insidious the last few months, and so somehow the prompts that were there for Into the Wild Woods kind of spoke to that, and it was kind of an amazing experience. And I'm going to talk about decks in a moment, but sort of working with the decks that I worked with and in the way that I did, and sort of interpreting the prompts the way that I did, it was this incredibly precise, sharp, cut to the bone clarity that I'm not used to in readings for myself, because I don't necessarily approach tarot as a reader for myself unless I'm asked to for others in a particularly spiritual way. But this was that. So, it was just a cool experience, and it engaged things that I've been thinking about and struggling with. And I don't know that I have the answers. In fact, I think what it did was sort of remind me of the things I needed to engage on, and I'm still going to keep working on engaging on those things in the next few months. But it was like this objective external thing saying, hey, here's the stuff you got to do, here's the stuff you got to be aware of, and the clarity and the precision was just kind of mind-boggling. So that's just in 12 minutes kind of a quick overview of why this was so impactful and powerful. And so it was a really special sort of experience to do, weirdly in public too. That was the other thing, was that I kind of, I didn't really share the context, but I did share the readings, and it was interesting. But I do that in part just to, because I'm always curious how people land on what they do as a reader. And I also feel like the core of me is an educator or a teacher. So I want to share how I got where I did. So, but that was, it was a really odd experience, and it was really cool and public. But that also helps me sort of, when I post a reading on Instagram for myself, it's like I have to do the work rather than just dismissing it, which I'm more likely to do when I'm just reading alone. So, So I guess that brings me to sort of, that was the work I did, and it was really special. I hate that word, but it was. And it was fascinating. Oh, God. The allergies, the colds, the whatever, the itchy nose, the runny nose, the dry red eyes. Winter, man. So what did I work with this month? Let's talk about the Wildwood Tarot, shall we? Because that was an interesting experience. I did an unboxing of it and a little walkthrough, I think. I mean, I did something with this deck. I can't quite remember what I said. But this was a deck that I was not... I avoided for years for some bizarre reason. And I just felt like it wasn't, I like I said earlier, I don't have a connection to Celtic shamanism. It's not my background, you know what I mean? Like I talked about my background a little bit. I'm French Canadian, which, there are of course Celtic roots everywhere. I mean, they were a culture, they were one of the formative cultures in the world, and certainly in Europe. And then preceding that, of course, the sort of cultures that built it. But it just felt like it wasn't mine to engage with, and I'm very thoughtful. I try to be very thoughtful about appropriating things that aren't mine, So while I loved the artwork of the Wildwood, I should probably do this side because of the lighting. Here's a card that came up a lot. Um, I loved the artwork. There were a few things about this deck that everyone's seen it, but I'm just going to show you some cards as I talk. Um, I loved the artwork, and I just felt like there was a few things about the deck that weren't for me. And one of them was that the Major Arcana had largely been really revised. Um, and I'm fairly traditional in my interpretations, so I sort of felt like, oh, I don't want to deal with that. You know what I mean? They made changes I don't like. And then the keywords on the minors were another thing that I just sort of felt like, I'm not interested in that. I don't like decks with keywords. I don't like to be told what to think a card means. So I avoided it, and hemmed and hawed because I was envious of people talking about it and how much they loved it. And I really, I would watch walkthroughs of it and think, God, this artwork's beautiful, but there's just, it's not mine, and the keywords and blah, blah, blah. And then as things were coming up for Into the Wildwood, I kind of got jealous, and I was like, well, I want to play. And so I gave in and ordered it, and immediately tried just a couple sample readings and just playing with it, and then it seemed to have like this this really clear excuse me, clear, powerful voice that was like, listen to me, I have these things to say to you, and they're gonna sort of go, right there. They're gonna go right to the heart. And so I thought, okay, let's chat. Let's have a little chat. Knowing the artwork was good already, so I started doing readings, and then the number of like repetitive cards that would come up, particularly the courts, particularly a few of the minors, the minor arcana, were kind of, it was just, it was a really odd, unusual experience for me. You get repetitive cards sometimes, but just the messages that were coming up were very clear, very specific. This is a card, Tradition, the 9 of Stones, that kept coming up. The King of Stones, the Wolf kept coming up. The Page of Vessels came up, the Otter a lot. There were these repetitive messages. The 3 of Stones, I feel like, came up a lot. It was just sort of, oh God, the 2 of Arrows kept coming up, Injustice. And it was like just cutting to things I needed. Transition, this card came up a few times. It was like, we're gonna, this deck just kept sort of hammering away at messages I needed to engage with. And I don't, like I said earlier, I'm not sure that I've completely finished those conversations, but having like an outside voice saying, yeah, this is the conversation you're supposed to be having, was kind of amazing. And every time, I mean, not exactly every time, but a lot of the times it was like, damn, like that's exactly what I need to hear right now, and that's what I'm struggling with, and that's what I need to wrestle with. So it was just an incredible experience. And the Fox was another one, and Foxes have been interesting for me because I think I talked about this before in another video, that I'd been doing a bunch of Lenormand readings, and the Fox kept coming up, and just sort of its traditional meaning. I thought, well, who is that? I thought, is that me? Like, that's not me. But even with this deck, I kept getting foxes. Like, there were foxes, foxes, foxes. All I knew about foxes was that they killed my friend's chickens. And literally, that was all I knew about them. They killed, like, my friend had a bunch of chickens. My partner went to go water their plants while they were on vacation, and all the chickens were dead. We found a chicken up in a tree, the only one that survived, alone, managed to sort of launch herself up into a tree. All I knew about foxes were as predators, but there was all this other energy, and it was like, I kept seeing the foxes, that card come up. It was just a really interesting experience to have that happen. And the other thing that was interesting too were the cards that didn't show up. You know what I mean? That to me is as interesting. There's 78 cards in a deck. You don't get every card every day, but when we're working with a card for a good 20, 25 days out of a 30-day month, it's, you're going to see a lot of the cards, but it was like the repetitions were so specific and the ones that were absent were so specific. It was just a really fascinating thing, and it was just addressing all the stuff I talked about earlier. Um, so, I'm so grateful for the experience, and that I gave in and stopped being a stupid moron and bought this deck and started working with it. So the experience of working with the Wildwood has been really special and unexpected. In fact, I don't think I would use this deck for reading with other people at this point, because it just sort of feels like I'm having this relationship with it and I'm not ready for like polyamory yet. And what was also interesting is that I'm not like, I didn't use this deck exclusively throughout the month. I used other things, and I used it in partnership with other things, but I have not had in a long time. I think the last time I was like, and it was just sort of because I loved the deck. The Shadowscapes Tarot, when that came out, was a deck that I kind of used almost exclusively. And since then, I've been pretty, I always joke about this. I'm pretty promiscuous about decks. I don't, I'm not fidelitous. Is that a word? I don't have a lot of fidelity to any one deck. This was the first time in a long time where I was monogamous with a deck, more or less. And it was an interesting experience to spend time with the system, in the deck. So I just thought, what a cool time. So it was fun. It was fun to play. And I'm gonna do like a little, at the end of this video, I'm gonna do like a formal review. But let me talk about the other decks that I worked with, because at the beginning of the month, I thought, I'm going to use all these decks. I'm going to use every nature-based deck I have. So I'm going to use the medicine cards. I'm going to use the wooden tarot, the wildwood tarot. I'm going to use the animal totem tarot. I bought recently the tarot of plants, which I did a walkthrough of. And actually, what I found was that my choices of decks were very, very limited. I sort of limited my palette quite a bit, which again was not something I expected to do. Part of it because I just felt like a loyalty to the wild unknown this month, which was interesting. And partly just because it was the ones I wanted to work with. Like, other decks just weren't singing out. So other than the wild unknown, the decks that I used were, there was a couple tarot decks. I used the Santa Muerta tarot, or Muerta. Muerta. That's what happens when you're trying to do the same video 3 times. Everyone's seen this deck by now too, but again, just sort of thinking about that ancestral stuff that I talked about earlier, and the idea of loss and dealing with those things. This deck came up a few times, and this is a deck that I thought might kind of just sit on the sidelines after October was over, but it's not going to. It's a deck that's going to stay out, and I, like other folks who didn't know a lot about this deck, I had very limited expectations of it coming in, and I think it's a brilliant deck. So I used this a couple times, and I think it's going to stay out and be used a little bit more. That was a deck that I used. That was potentially the only other tarot I used. I used the Neoclassico at least once or twice, and this is an Il Minigello deck, which I think is a stunner. It's a pip deck, and it's a beautiful pip deck, and I used that once or twice for my Instagram readings anyway. And I wasn't even doing a lot of tarot readings. Like, when I did readings for other folks, it was often a Sibylla reading, in fact, because that has become a big part of my practice. I used the Tower of the Sevenfold Mystery once or twice, because I got it this month and I wanted to play with it. But in terms of tarot, it was really limited to the Wildwood. Were there others? The Marshmallow Marseille, of course, and the Jean Noblet, of course, but that was it. And then I used some Oracle decks, which again was an interesting experience. Technology is killing me today. I just did this next part a 4th time, and I have to do it again. My dedication to this video. So Oracle decks are interesting because I don't work with them much, and I don't find them super useful in many ways. I mean, I do work with decks like Sibylla, which is an I class that as an Oracle, or the Celia Melvilleville Tarot Oracle of Reflections. Decks that seem to have a system to them I use. And then I used this month a little bit the Rackham Oracle, which I was totally surprised by. Not, I believed when people told me it was beautiful and that it was a good reader. I just didn't expect it to read as well as it does. I mean, it's so crisp and terse, and it shuffles amazing. I mean, this is cardstock that's meant to be shuffled. So that was a cool thing to work with. Despite my my quibble with one of the decks that they offer at that publisher, Ducksuit. And then the other Oracle deck that was probably the biggest part of my month was the Celtic, the Druid plant and animal oracles. So I did videos about these two decks together. The plant oracle is harder to get, but you can if you order through Amazon UK. It's only available in the UK for some reason. eBay will tell you it's out of print. It's not. It's just not in print in the US. And then the animal oracle is gettable, that you can find. What I did with this deck was I actually wrote keywords from the book in silver so I could kind of see them, but they weren't obstructing my view, so to speak. And I worked with this in a pretty simple way. I just would look at the prompt for the day or the keyword for the day, and then I would draw an oracle card to sort of explore how that was active or activated in my life at the moment. The B was like community or organization. So I would say, okay, that's the keyword. So if I'm looking at crossroads in my community, so that would refine the reading, and then I would draw cards from the wild unknown to explore how, when, why, whatever. I would extrapolate on the cards in that way. I love these two decks together. I love them separately. I'm not super wild about the border. I don't care about the white border. I've seen this trimmed. It looks great. And I've seen it trimmed with the white border and trimmed with the inner border. This actually really matches the Druid Craft Tarot really well because it was designed by the same authors in collaboration with Will Worthington. The art style is actually different enough that you can sort of see that it's not quite the same. There's a slightly more realistic or refined quality to the Wildwood than this. Not in a bad way. It's a slightly different style. You can tell it's the same artist though. So that was really cool to work with. I love the decks together. There's benefits to having them separately. There's benefits to having them together. But once you shuffle a deck, it's not like you can separate them. Of course you can. This was a deck too where I got a lot of repetitions because there were a couple cards I kept getting, and then there were a couple where I was going to take them out, like all the dragon cards. I felt like you have a deck of real animals and then 4 dragons, what? But I left them in, and they kept showing up. So sometimes you get messages that you aren't expecting. So I use this one a lot. Unlike the Wildwood, which I probably will not use for others, this I would use for others. I would use it as a prompt for a reading because I find working with the guidebooks and choosing the keywords. There's a lot of keywords for each card. There's a description of each card in the guidebooks. I read through and I chose keywords that felt like across the 2 decks would give me a balance. So I feel like there's enough balance and a nice balance in this combo of decks to make a nice prompt for reading, which is how I use oracles. The other 2 oracles that I used, both I bought specifically for this month. The first I did a video on because I doctored it. This is the Sacred Visions Oracle. This is relatively new. The backs were this were the kind of cards where the backs were the keyword and the description that you get in the guidebook, and I didn't like that. So I covered them a la Veronica Jude in there I am, can you see me? In contact paper. Such beautiful art. And then so I wrote the keywords in copper, and then the cards are numbered, but I haven't found that those matter that much. Art wise, it's just breathtaking. It reminds me of a combination of, I think, the Messenger cards and the Weaver's Oracle. It's very glossy, but still, it's thin cardstock. It shuffles nicely. It's really breathtaking. And there's this quality to these cards that there's this feeling in them. This isn't passive art, a lot of it. Especially the cards with, there's one that just always gets me. there's one of them. You just get this sense of like a cry. You know what I mean? Like, it's just breathtaking art. I'm trying to find the other one that I was. Oh, here it is. You just hear these people yelling. I don't know. And the keywords are great. And the tension between the keywords and the art is always really interesting. And then there's this card with Andrew Jackson. You know, if you know anything about American history and the Trail of Tears, like this card, which is called Flourish, with a picture of Andrew Jackson tearing out a tree by the roots. It's just breathtaking. So I love this deck. And I used it in the same way I used the Druid Plant and Animal Oracles. And I think it's a beautiful deck. There's not a lot of cards in this one. I think there's like 30 or so. But it's beautiful. That one I bought on a whim in Barnes & Noble because I was waiting for this deck to come in, and I'm impatient. So this is the Shamanic Medicine cards. I did do a walkthrough of this too. This I had to get through the book depository. It's not yet available in the United States. It will be in February, distributed by Llewellyn. I thought this was going to have a Native American theme because it looked that way from the images that I saw. It has more of a generally shamanic and more specifically Australian or of that area quality to it. But again, it has like a nice... The keywords are relatively positive to neutral, but the art is beautiful. It's a little inconsistent, but, you know, nothing's perfect. And again, I can see using this as a prompt for a general reading. And it also has this really nice cardstock that... it's very different from other Blue Angel decks I have. It's not glossy. It's about the same thickness, but it's matte, and I really like that. So this I did a walkthrough of if you want to see it. It's out there. But I only used this once or twice because I didn't have it that long, but I think it's a stunner. And it's got a nice... I don't want to say balance because it is really neutral to positive, but it's neutral enough that it can be used... to spark a reading, that it's not just affirmation. So those are the oracles. Were there anything else? I used the Animal Totem once or twice, and I do like that deck, and I really love the book. It just, you know, it was funny how certain decks were calling out to me, so I just listened to the call of the wild, because it's the Wildwood, y'all. So I think lastly, what I want to do is just kind of just do something I don't usually do, right? Because normally when I talk about a deck, it's a deck that I'm on, not necessarily unboxing, but I'm sharing my thoughts on it after just a couple days. This is really the first time that I had the experience of really focusing on a deck, not exclusively, but intensely over the course of a time period. I've never really done that before with intent. And the Wildwood is one of those. It's really the only one. And so I have a perspective on it that's, you know, I just want to share and talk about it. It's a little unusual, I guess. Maybe it's not unusual. I don't know, but I want to share it. So I talked at the beginning of the video about how I was not, I just didn't feel like it was a deck I was supposed to connect with and that it was for me. So coming into it, I didn't have a lot of expectation of it. In fact, I had fairly low expectations of it, which of course proved to be unfounded. And so I just want to give you some thoughts about it as sort of an objective standpoint. You know, I'm gonna be honest about the good things. I'm gonna be honest about the bad things, and I'm just gonna tell you, you know, because this is a unique experience for me to sort of. Normally, I gush about decks, and I don't like to say negative things, or if I don't like a deck, I generally don't talk about it. But this one, you know, it has a lot to say, and because I've been so intimate with it, you know, I have a lot to say about it too. So, here are things that I have learned about this deck. One, the keywords on the minors do not remotely bug me. I've already flipped through this. They don't bug me, although I found myself using this more from the perspective of the keywords more often than not. So if I got a card that said rebirth on it, I was generally... This is what this one says. Can you see that? Because my hand's in the way. If I got the Eight of Vessels and I saw rebirth, what I was often not doing was thinking, okay, the Eight of Vessels is the Eight of Cups, and that suggests to me emotional labor, right? Emotional work. I wasn't thinking in terms of the system I'm using. I was saying, okay, this card represents rebirth, and I was in that way kind of using it more like an oracle deck in the case of the pips, or the miners, where a core card appeared. I was using the guidebook, and that was an interesting thing too. So, I do not generally work with guidebooks, and I do not generally find myself like reaching for the guidebook when I'm doing a reading. Um, and this one I did, and so I would, when I got a core card, which I did a lot, what I would do is I would go to the guidebook and I would sort of skim it and look for keywords in the description or the meaning of the card to explore just what zinged, what connected. So I wasn't like poring over the definition, but I was exploring it. And I would do that for the minors too. And of course, I would do that for the trumps because I used the book a lot. So I didn't read with this deck in the way that I usually read a tarot deck, which is primarily from my knowledge of, or my experience of the meaning of the card, the images, if there are any, and then the numerological and elemental associations. I was not doing that most of the time, but I would occasionally sort of reach for. So I would get the Eight of Vessels and find Reunion. I'm sorry, Rebirth. And I would sometimes start there or look at the guidebook, and then I would also say, oh, Eight of Vessels, Eight of Cups represents work and hard work and effort and emotion and feeling. So I would sort of put together that, but I didn't do that all that much. When it came to the court cards, I always went to the guidebook because I was interested in what they thought about the animal energy, and I kept getting the wolf, the otter, the salmon came up a couple times, the fox came up a lot. So I was getting similar things. So I wanted to just kind of keep going to the book and see what it said. And again, I would reach for. Sorry, I have an itch on my foot. I would reach for the book to sort of see what it said. And then with the majors or the trumps, it was always going to the book to sort of explore. But again, I would skim the page. I wouldn't like pour over it. I would look for keywords or energies that like clicked and made me go, oh yeah, that's interesting. That connects to what I'm going through. So in that regard, I feel like this is a deck where I think a few things. I think if you're picking this deck up fresh, if you're a new reader and you're coming to this deck, you're probably going to need the guidebook because you're going to want to know how to read. If you're an experienced reader, I think there are, even though they made a lot of changes to the trumps, I feel like you can draw enough lines between like the guardian and the devil, especially if you know much about like the history of religion in the world, right? And you say, oh, the devil's a Christian construct and it represents evil, but what came before that was this idea of shadow and that we have to live in the dark times as well as the light times, and so the guardian, the devil, represents more than just evil. It represents the darker parts that guard us against getting, whatever. I think you could draw connections. But as an experienced reader, one of the things that I had to do early on was say, I'm not going to look at this in terms of the system I know. I'm going to look at this as a fresh, new system that I don't know, except that it's a different way of looking at tarot, and going from there, and learning it on its own terms, and not trying to compare too much to what I know, but to work with what their effort is pushing me toward, and so in that regard, I feel like you could read this without the guidebook, but I also feel like you might be depriving yourself of an experience that's potentially interesting and useful and enlightening if you don't use the guidebook, at least for a few weeks. You know what I mean? Like if you sort of approach this deck with like the Into the Wildwoods approach, and you have like a thing every day, and you go to the card and you go to the guidebook, I don't think you have to like be married to the guidebook forever. In fact, I found myself in the last week or two, like in the first few weeks, I looked at it for almost every card. Now I'm looking at it less and less because I've gotten a sense of the cards, especially the ones that kept showing up. But even with the cards that keep showing up, I sort of want to go like, oh, let me go back to the guidebook and see what I missed. You know what I mean? Because if it keeps showing up, maybe I missed something. So I feel like the guidebook itself is worth making part of your practice if you get this deck. I really think that. In terms of the cards, I think the system is really smart. I was really resistant to the changes they made to the Major Arcana, but I'm over that. Because again, it hasn't deprived me of the systems I know. It's just another system for me to play with and have access to. And then in terms of the minors, the keywords are there, the images are beautiful. And then in terms of the courts, I really feel like, if you have a general system for reading page, knight, king, queen, whatever, you can use it. But I feel like there's nuance that you get from what the animal is and does that it's nuance. If you're going to use this deck, learn the system or explore the system at least, because otherwise just use the tarot deck you always use. Now, let me talk about the books. So in terms of the guidebooks, when I first got the deck and I read through the guidebook, I thought, oh, it's okay, it's fine. The thing that seemed to call out or to be the most useful was the stuff that I actually bookmarked, which was the stuff about the Wheel of the Year. Because it's so different, and the way that the trumps sort of live on the wheel. That wound up actually being something I did not think about all that much. And in fact, I would get trumps in my readings, but in the majority of the readings I got were actually courts in minors. Like the cards that kept showing up were courts and minors. When I get a new deck, I'm not a fan of like sitting down and poring over each word in the description. I'm just at a point in my reading where like reading a description of the card and then the meaning of the card, like that, I just get bored with that, honestly. But working with it, so I scanned it. I read the majors because they were so different. I read the courts. I skimmed the minors because the keyword is the keyword. It tells me what I need to know. And then I read the end. And I thought, okay, this is a fine guidebook. It's a guidebook for a deck, and it's well written and it's thoughtful, and the stuff about why the deck is the way it is, that was interesting. Some stuff about the archetypes they switched to, that was interesting. What I have found, though, is that it's actually a better guidebook in working with the deck as I do readings, as I sort of, and I could have worked with the deck intuitively or based on the systems I know, but I found that working with the guidebook for the last 3 or 4 weeks in that way helped me understand the deck more, and it helped me appreciate the guidebook more. But again, that's another reason why I probably wouldn't use this deck to read for others, is because there's a connection between the deck and the guidebook that I'm still working through. And again, I just feel like I'm not welcoming or ready to welcome other people in. But I have a better appreciation for the guidebook now that I've worked with it, with the cards. And though I'm easing away from it, I found it better than my instinct initially told me it was, in my cynical, judgy way. Now, let me address something that's kind of an elephant in the room. The Wild Magic. So this is the book that prompted it all, though, Into the Wildwood, I believe. So this is by Mark Ryan and John Matthews, the same writers who created the Wildwood Tarot guidebook. And then they use images from Will Worthington in this. Now, this is a separate, it doesn't come with the deck. It's a new book. I'm just going to be really honest about it. Okay, so here are some things I think about this book. It was marketed as a workbook, and I think that was a mistake. I have heard people disappointed with this book, and one of the reasons why I think that's so is I don't know if it was the authors and the marketers, maybe it was a combination of both, maybe it was the marketers, I don't know, but I think that the expectations were not accurate. And so how this book was marketed and set up set people up to expect something else. And I think when people realized that it wasn't that, they were like, well, this isn't what I wanted, because the result didn't match the expectation, because it's billed as a workbook. It's not a workbook. It's not a workbook. It's there's a lot of stuff in this book that I think is thoughtful, but in terms of thinking about a workbook, it's not what most people think of as a workbook. There are some things in the last few chapters that involve action and activity. That's what I think people expect when they expect a workbook. So I think that the expectations were set incorrectly at the start, and I think that was a mistake. I think if the expectations had been more accurate, where like it's an expansion on the guidebook, it's new thoughts and musings on the Wildwood, I think if that had been marketed that way, that would have set expectations. Would it have sold as well? Probably, because if the deck is as popular as it seems to be, I think people would be like, I want to hear more about what these guys have to say. And so I think in that regard, the priming was bad, and like this is a thing that I talk about in training, right? Setting learners up, priming them for the experience they're going to have accurately and effectively is wise. And I do not think we were primed for this book the way we were supposed to. Now, I did not have the deck. I had no expectations of this book. And so I wasn't disappointed or not. After reading the guidebook, there were things that I wanted expanded on. And so my feelings about this book were, I hope that it talks more about shamanism. I hope it talks more about the Wheel of the Year. I hope it expands on the things that I liked about this book. It doesn't do that. And so to me, I was a little like, oh. But again, I had zero expectation. I didn't buy this. In fact, this was gifted to me. And I should say that, start from a generous place. This was gifted to me by Melissa, by Taranis. And, sometimes people just intuit what you're looking for. And she said, hey, I've got, can I send this to you? And I said, sure. I've been thinking about this. So, but I didn't have any expectation of it. I had hopes based on the guidebook. But I do think the expectations were skewed. What I liked about this book were things like the first chapter, which was patterns, and it talked about ancient myths and the shape of the year. So it was stuff that I was interested in. I wish that I wish there had been more about that, but it did. It was effective for me. The lore, I believe, of the Wildwood, where they talk about the archetypes of the Trumps. That was interesting. I enjoyed that. Things that I did not enjoy about the book. I thought the chapter on quantum view of the tarot, I thought that was interesting, but that it just didn't connect to me. And again, this is just my opinion. To me, it didn't connect to this deck. I feel like there's a separate deck to be made using that theory. But when I look at this deck and I think of like this world that they've depicted, quantum mechanics, which is interesting to me, this isn't that, you know what I mean? And so I felt like it was just a little out of place. It was interesting. It just didn't connect. It didn't create the connection I was looking for. And then the worst thing I have to say about this book, and again, I'm just going to be honest and take this with a grain of salt because it's just one guy's opinion. I think it's chapter 4. Yes. Chapter 4, where it's called Wild Archetypes, where one of the authors, I think it's Mark Ryan, kind of goes through his personal experience with the archetypes or the experiences of the Trumps. Frustrated me. And I'm just going to be honest and tell you why, and this is just my opinion, and it probably comes out of my own negative, cynical, awful personality. But I love when people explore their personal experiences with tarot in real life. The idea of saying, oh, I had this tower experience, let me tell you about it. I had this lover's experience. I had this moon, whatever. I think that the way that you learn the Trumps is by finding those experiences in life. And so that idea of sort of an author, especially a creator of a deck who sort of designed the deck with an artist and sat down and said, here's what this card means, and to go through that and then experience it and see the artwork that they worked with an artist on and then experience that in real life, I think is kind of cool. Where it felt down to me, and again, this is my perception, it's not the reality, but this is how I perceived that section, was that it was more about name dropping and sort of look at these cool people I know and these things I've done than a sort of practical or experiential musing on the archetypes. And so I felt turned off by that section to the point where I had a hard time enjoying the rest of the book, to be honest. But again, remember, those are my triggers, right? That triggered me in a way that I did not enjoy. And that's, that was something that stuck with me as I experienced the rest of the book. I don't know or believe that that was the intent of the author. It's just how it triggered me. It's how it perceived me. It felt like a thing of like, look, it it felt more about like, oh, look, I know Tony Hopkins, than it did about, let me tell you about my experience of the Green Man. Again, that's my feeling, but it just turned me off. Um, so that's that. And then the rest of the book, in terms of reading with the part two, which was practice, um, I think that the part two was could have been 3 times as long. I think that's what people were hoping for, and it was brief, but I thought that part was good. Although my experience was tainted a bit by the experience before it. So, um, so as a reviewer, I would say that if you're interested in Wildwood Tarot and you don't have it, and it's piquing your interest, I would get it. And I would get it, and I would work with the guidebook, and I would explore it in a unique way, and I would not try to assign or necessarily like force your experience, your own system on it. I think I would let the guidebook and the deck work together to teach you a new system, a different system. In terms of wild magic, if you enjoy reading about tarot and you enjoy going deeper into different aspects of this deck, then get it. I don't believe that it's necessary for getting the most out of the deck. I think the deck and the guidebook that it comes with are all you need, and they work together really well. I think individual on its own, the guidebook is less impressive than it is when you're engaged with the deck and just sort of getting your hands in the sandbox. So that's my thoughts on that deck and the 2 books that go with it. After about a month of working on it, so that's been Into the Wildwoods for me, and this is my ending for the month. I will likely keep working with the Wildwood. I don't know if I'll do it every day, but I will probably reach for it when I need it, and I'll probably keep it out so that I remember it's there. I'd love. I don't have seasonal decks. I don't sort of class my decks seasonally. It's hard to say, but it does make me kind of want to. After October and working all of my like darker decks, and then this month and working with these decks, I like the idea of choosing like 2 or 3 decks to just spend some intimate time with over a month. And so I don't know if I don't know what decks to do that with for sort of December, Christmas, Yule. If you have suggestions, let me know, because I'm always looking to spend money. I did just get the Vachetta deck. I got the Tower of the Sevenfold Mystery. I think I'm going to do a video. I got another deck that I've been avoiding, and I'm early days with it, but I'm sort of like, oh, okay. Like the Wildwood, I'm saying like, okay, I see you. You're not this, but you're this, and I'm okay with that. So I'm just experimenting with another deck, and I'll let you know what that is in a few weeks. And I'm going to do a video with the Wildwood in this and maybe another one. So, yeah, I mean, was this necessary? Was it worth the 3 attempts to do it? I felt like I wanted to talk about this and share this experience with you, and so I hope it was interesting. I think, thank you to Kelly and the folks whose idea this was to do, because it clearly had a pretty deep impact on me this month, and I think that was cool, because again, that's not something I reach to tarot for, and I don't know that I would do this with every deck, but this experience was really positive. So that's my journey into the Wildwood. Would love to hear yours. I think that this was super cool. I loved this tag. I loved this theme. I loved these prompts. I loved the spreads that Kelly came up with, and I'm super happy to have a community that does this sort of stuff. So those are my long discursive thoughts on Into the Wildwood. So be good, take care, and this is super cool, and we'll talk to you soon.